Okay, well, I've got 1201, so I will get started by talking a little bit about myself, and then folks who are later or delayed for whatever reason can join us as they're able, and all they'll miss is me explaining who I am and why I'm talking about the Mpre. So my name is Jennifer Carr, and I have been doing bar prep for about 15 years now, actually for exactly 15 years now, like as of 2 days ago, it's been 15 years. So I really enjoy working with folks who are preparing for the bar. I'm licensed in California and Nevada, and I've worked in law schools in both states, and have recently moved over to BarMax. And so today I want to talk a little bit about some sort of perspective changes that you're going to need to make if you're going to be successful on the Mpre. And then I want to talk a little bit about BarMax and like what makes BarMax special, and like why did I make that switch from academia to BarMax and all of that piece of it. I'm glad that you've joined us today. I hope you'll find this useful. We do have a number of free products that you can try out. And what I have traditionally told applicants is that you should feel free to try out different bar prep providers and their Mpre materials. The same folks who write the multiple choice portion of the bar exam, the MBE, are the same folks who write the Mpre. And so seeing how well it works to help you prepare for the Mpre can be really useful in terms of the other the preparation for the bar exam itself. Now, as we go in through here, feel free to ask questions in the chat. And Celeste, who's here, and Katie, who are here, will try to answer those questions as they can, and or we'll get to them at the if you use the Q&A button. Okay. So with that, let me go ahead and turn over to our presentation. Okay, so when we were kind of kicking around like titles for today and like what do we want to talk about and like Mpre, like what can we tell folks about the Mpre? What is important for them to know? One of the things that I really came up with is the idea that the way you prepare in law school for your professional responsibility class is going to be different from the way that you prepare as for the actual bar exam itself, right? Like for the Mpre. And so what are those differences? Like how would we express them? And so ideally your PR class in school, or some of you may have called it ethics, but at the law schools I've been at, we've always called it PR, but it's the same thing, right? Professional responsibility, professional ethics, legal ethics. It's all one big happy family of being ethical lawyers, right? So most of those classes tend to focus on, how do we help you prepare in the way that's going to get you out into practice, and you're not going to be getting disciplined, you're not going to be getting, sued, you're going to be an ethical lawyer, it's going to be good. The Mpre is a little bit of a paradigm shift. So sometimes students will tell me like, Jen, I prepared for there's my dog shaking his collar. Hey, there's dogs want to say hello to you. There's this paradigm shift from the perspective as like, what am I going to do to go out and practice and keep myself safe, to like, what do I need to know to actually pass this exam? So, and I'm going to talk about the exam itself, but so in my mind, and sometimes you may have heard this expressed slightly differently, and I'll talk about what that might have looked like. But in my mind, there's like the Better Call Saul guy, right? Who is just like super unethical. And you're like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? Like nobody would be this sort of so unethical in this way. And I'm going to date myself here a little bit. This guy over here in the corner is Matlock. I grew up watching Matlock. And to me, I was always like, oh, he seems like such a great attorney. And to be honest, I haven't rewatched it since law school, 20 years ago. And so I have no idea if he is actually ethical. But in my mind, he's like the ethical guy, the attorney we all want to be. And then there's Jack McCoy, right? For those of you who've watched Law and Order. And, Jack just always seems to be like right on the line. And you're like, I don't know if that's exactly the argument I would have made. Or, geez, I'm not entirely sure that, that's an appropriate response there, Jack. But he doesn't seem to get in trouble, right? Like he just seems to kind of walk the line. And so the subtitle of today's presentation, MPRE versus practice, another way to think about that, or an alternate title, would be Jack McCoy. How to be Jack McCoy. How to be the person who kind of walks the line. And then, we have, if we think about like law school, and I mentioned this, right? The goal of your law school, of your professional responsibility class in law school, was create Matlocks, right? People who are going to go out and they're going to be intelligent, and they're going to be ethical, and they're going to, do what they need to do to ensure that justice is done. So what are the best practices? So it's not like what's possible, it's what should you do? What is the right thing to do? And oh, hey, let's also talk about these areas of ambiguity and how, yeah, it's kind of ambiguous, but like, be on this side of the rule. Like, be, if the line is here, be here, right? Be on the other side of the line to where you know that you're going to be safe. Like, don't just meet the rule, exceed it. And, this helps the school's, graduates avoid liability and discipline. And it means, sort of in the objective, like really kind of, abstract way, it helps the school because it means that their alums are not, going out and behaving in ways that might bring dishonor to the school. And it also means the alums are satisfied because they're leaving and they know what they need to do in order to avoid liability and discipline. And there's this more like esoteric, okay, and hopefully we're helping lawyers, go out and do the quote right thing, right? The goal of the National Conference of Bar Examiners, who I'm going to refer to as the NCBE, National Conference of Bar Examiners, is basically just like, let's keep out the Better Call Sauls. Like, just don't be Saul. Don't do that. We just don't want, we're not necessarily trying to, it's not a formative assessment. We're not trying to get you to be more ethical. We just want to try to weed out the folks who are unethical. And I'm not saying that they necessarily do this super well. I'm just saying that's their goal, right? Is like not allowing folks who are not familiar with the rules to practice. And so what the MPRE is designed to do is really, if we just boil it down to the bare minimum, is to test your knowledge of the rules. It's not to test what is right. It's not to test what you should do. It's what you can do. And so I mentioned earlier, you may not have heard the like Better Call Saul, Jack McCoy paradigm. Sometimes folks will say, well, it's kind of like, you have your goody two shoes answer, and then you have like your clearly sleazy answer, and the correct answer choice is going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's a decent way to think about it too, right? So that's why I picked Jack McCoy, right? He's not really what I would say the kind of person who's necessarily following best practices. He's not the guy that's like, necessarily being the most ethical, highest standards, whatever. But he's also not being unethical, right? He's not violating the rules. He knows exactly where the limit is, and he can come right up to that limit, but he doesn't go over it. And so as you're preparing for the bar exam, I want you to think about being that lawyer, right? That Jack McCoy-esque lawyer who says, I know where the law is, I know what I need to do to be ethical. And maybe I was here when I was in PR, but for the MPRE, I'm going to be here just at the line. I'm not Better Call Saul, and I'm not, over here being super lawyer. I'm just going to be kind of right at the line itself. And that is really going to take a paradigm shift. And so, the first step is just think about this paradigm shift. Think about the fact that there are different goals between the class and the exam. Class is designed to prepare you to go out into the world and to represent the school well and to represent your clients well and to ensure you aren't sued. The bar exam, the MPRE, is just designed to keep people who do not know the rules from practicing law. That's it. So how are you going to be successful? Well, you need to memorize the rules, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And you need to practice the questions, and we're going to talk about more about that as well. And in terms of just the paradigm shift, I want you to take the middle path, right? So channel, that was something that Buddha said, you can channel your inner Buddha. But, this idea that if we have super good lawyer and we have kind of sleazy lawyer, the correct answer will be somewhere in the middle. I'm going to just check the chat really quick. Okay. Okay. And then if we think about this paradigm shift, or we think about this timeline, and we kind of talked about here's the line, whatever. Don't forget that the Mpre is also going to test what is sometimes called the Code of Judicial Conduct, or you may have heard it called the Canon of Judicial Conduct, or the Judicial Canon. Some law schools do teach that. Some do not. So if this is unfamiliar for you, this is another way that this is going to be a little bit different. You're going to need to know the judicial canon. And so I kind of put the gavel right there, kind of, just a little bit ahead of the ethical line, because for judges, you have to avoid not just, impropriety, but also the appearance of impropriety. So, I would put Judge Judy in sort of the Better Call Saul-esque category, right? Like she's the one she's one of those TV judges, sort of inherited from People's Court. I think they're actually different shows, but, sort of same type of idea. Like people are going in and they're suing each other. And, Judge Judy will say things like, stop talking. I don't even need to hear this, right? Okay. Even if you don't know any of the judicial canon, like you probably know that judges are not supposed to tell people, hey, just stop talking. This judge up here, I forget his last name. It's something that starts with S. His first name's Frank, and he's been viral a few times. He's a judge in traffic court in Rhode Island. And so he really tries to do a good job of being firm, enforcing the rules, but also being compassionate and fair. And so this is the judge that you want to be. You want to be the person who knows the rules, and you can, follow the rules to the extent that they're being tested on the Mpre. So that's great, Jen. What is this Mpre? You keep talking about it. I'm here. What is it? So the Mpre is written by the National Conference of Bar Examiners. As I said, the NCBE. Sometimes you'll hear them called the NCBEX, EX for examiners. There we go. And they have a website, www.ncbex.com, I think. Might be .org. But in any case, that's why you'll see it sometimes called NCBEX. So you're going to have 2 hours to take the exam, and it's all administered on computer by Pearson VUE, and it's generally offered 3 times a year. How is it scored? Well, there's going to be 60 questions. 50 of them are actually graded. 10 are what is called experimental questions. So these are newer questions, and they're going to be administered across a few administrations before they're actually adopted and incorporated into some future, administration where it becomes actually a graded question. And those graded questions, are scaled. Well, I shouldn't say the questions themselves. The exam is scaled, and therefore your scores can range from 50 to 150. And most states, going to require in the high 70s, low 80s to pass. Definitely check the pass rate for your individual state, because you want to make sure you're clearing that pass rate for your state. In terms of topics that are fair game, anything that's on the ABA Model Rules of Professional Conduct. I had one of the things that BarMax offers is if you work through our questions, you'll see that we have message boards where you can ask questions about the Mpre. You can ask, you can chat with other applicants, but you can also say Jen, well, you wouldn't say Jen, but you could write a question and we monitor those. And so, I was answering a question for a student recently who said, well, I don't understand because I thought that an attorney had to do XYZ thing. And the answer is you're right. In your state, an attorney does have to do those things. But on the Mpre, we're going to follow the model rules. And so you have to know the model rules. And unfortunately, you may also have to know your state's rules for your state's bar exam. So just be aware of those model rules. That's probably what you spent quite a bit of time with in law school, although most law schools will also bring in their state's canon. So just know that there's those two things out there. As we mentioned, the Model Code of Judicial Conduct, and this is not something that most law schools spend much time with. So, I do want you to take a look at it and make sure that you're comfortable with it. It's pretty intuitive. Like I said, you're still going to pick that middle path, but, be aware that that's something that is tested. And then this is the way the National Conference explains it. They say the controlling constitutional decisions and generally accepted principles established in leading federal and state cases and procedural and evidentiary rules. So you want to remember that professional responsibility does overlap with Civ Pro, right? So remember that in Civ Pro, you can be subject to Rule 11 sanctions. You can also, let's say that you suggest that your client destroy evidence. Well, now you've got a spoliation problem in Civ Pro, and you've also got an ethical problem for PR. So sometimes applicants will leave the Mpre and they'll say, Jen, they asked me a question about evidence. Well, it wasn't really evidence. It was, can you, allow your client to take the stand if you believe that he might tell an untruth or a lie, right? Or it was, what information does the attorney-client privilege protect? And so you just want to be aware that these intersections exist. And, as we mentioned, the leading federal and state cases, which you will have talked about in your professional responsibility classes. So, all right, Jen, I'm on board. How do I pick this middle path? How do I be Jack McCoy? What does that look like? So I found this question, and of course, it's an assistant district attorney, just like Jack. So here's the question. And I would suggest that you start with the call. And that's the part down here that has the question mark, right? I like that because a lot of times it'll kind of get you in the mindset of like, what are they going to ask? Sometimes it'll say, is this, admissible under the attorney-client privilege doctrine or something like that, where, you're going to say, oh, it's one of those intersections or, whatever the case may be. So is it proper for attorney beta to continue to represent DEFT? Well, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but we started there. While an assistant district attorney, comma. So I want y'all to focus on a couple of things. One is we've got a timeline here. So this while word tells us, what was going on. Well, what's our timeline? Well, it was during this period. And so as you're reading these questions, I want you to think about, the timeline aspect of it. I also want you to use your grammar clues. So if we've got a comma like this, that's going to be important. If you've got quotes, that's going to be important. If there's, some kind of exclamation point, that could be important. So pay attention to timelines, pay attention to your grammar clues. Attorney Alpha was in charge of the presentation, before a grand jury of evidence that led to an indictment charging 32 defendants. Anytime you get numbers, those are going to be important too. So it's going to matter here that there's 32 defendants and not one or two or whatever, 32 defendants with conspiracy to sell controlled drugs. Shortly after the grand jury returned the indictments, notice again a timeline, shortly after, and the comma, which is our grammar clue, Alpha resigned as a district attorney and became an associate in the law office of attorney Beta, comma, grammar clue again, a sole practitioner. At the time of such association, comma, Beta was the attorney for defendant, one of the indicted co-defendants. Is it proper for attorney Beta to continue to represent DEFT? So a couple of things. One is when we're going to go read these answer choices, I want you to kind of have an answer in mind, if at all possible. But, hey, we're just beginning our study here. So, what does it look like to, not yet have that answer choice? If you don't know what the correct answer is, just sort of off, sort of attacking this problem, what you can then do is to read the question. So, and what a lot of folks want to do is they want to be like, is it proper for attorney beta to continue to represent defendant? Yeah, seems okay to me. Don't do that. There's a lot of places for intuition. This is not one of them. So I don't want you to focus so much on the yes, yes, no, no. I want you to try to focus on the reasoning. Okay. So yes, if alpha does not reveal to beta any confidence or secret learned while an assistant district attorney. Yes, because a public prosecutor must make timely disclosure to the defense attorney of any exculpatory evidence. No, unless alpha agrees not to participate in the representation of deft. No, because alpha had substantial responsibility for the indictment of deft. Okay, so, whoops. There we go. I want to show you our outline and kind of what does this look like. So one of the things that we're going to try to do is to keep this as simple as we can, which allows you then to have, just the information you have to have in order to be prepared, right? Whoops. There we go. Nope, that's not it. There we go. Okay, so we're going to try to make sure you have just the information you need in order to be prepared. We're not going to try to inundate you with, a huge stack of books. We're going to give you, the app, and the paper books, like the paper books are like, I don't know, maybe like that, right? As opposed to like huge. For the Mpre, it's very short. I'm speaking, of course, of the entire set for the whole bar exam, not just the Mpre. So a former government lawyer or judge, if a lawyer is employed by a firm and has confidential information regarding a government matter obtained through previous representation of the government, the firm may properly represent another client against the government if the following requirements are satisfied. And then it tells you 1, ethical wall, 2, no sharing of fees, and 3, written notice. Like, what do you have to do? So as you are preparing, as I mentioned, ideally, you're going to kind of be able to work through this problem. You're going to kind of IRAC it in your own mind. And so I want you to really, really focus on memorizing. And here I've just kind of tried to highlight this adjective, may properly represent another client against the government if the following requirements are satisfied. I also want you to keep in mind the exceptions. So one of the things that can be super frustrating, both in terms of that paradigm shift, but also just in terms of the way that we rethink our requirements, is that we don't necessarily test on the big rule, right? The overarching rule. You're going to end up being tested on the exceptions. So, it would be easy to memorize this or to kind of understand this as, look, if you have confidential information, don't represent, the client. But that would actually be an error. You don't want to do that if you can avoid it. You want to focus on the exceptions to those rules. And part of that is like just the nature of the exam. It's going to focus on the exceptions, but it's also partly that paradigm shift, right? Like, what would Jack McCoy do? Would he go out and I'm not going to go into private practice and represent because of reasons? No, he's going to say, look, I can do this, but only when I adhere to certain exceptions. And so as you're going through and you're memorizing, I want you to focus on the exception. And so if we look at this, look, you can represent them, but only if these other, matters are met, right? So the question is, can beta represent defendant if is it proper for attorney beta to continue to represent defendant? And, if we look at our rule, whoops. There we go. So we've got a lawyer who's employed by a firm and they have confidential information. Yes, this was the guy who presented this information to the grand jury. The firm, so Beta, can represent another client against the government. Well, this is not necessarily another client, right? Like this is defendant. So we can use that answer to that rule to help guide us to the correct answer. And we want to reach our decision before we even get to that answer choice. So no, because Alpha had substantial responsibility for the indictment of death, right? It's not another defendant, it's the same defendant. Okay. Whoops. There we go. So before I jump into kind of what makes BarMax unique and like why does that matter and what's important about it, let me check the Q&A. Oh, good question. So this is someone who's remained anonymous, and they say, in taking the practice questions and reviewing the answers, I've noticed several explanations referencing comments to the rules. Are there any particular comments that we should spend more time reviewing than others? There's a lot. Thanks. So, and here's what I would say. I find the rules themselves to be fairly approachable. Like they're not too challenging. I've been going through our PR materials for BarMax and going actually through the model rules and also our California rules. And they're not terrible, right? Like they're actually fairly readable. So it's certainly, you know, and if you find that useful, please go check the rules. You can actually, I go to the ABA website and they have a really great section on the actual rules themselves. And then they also have another chart that actually will show you all of the differences between the rules. So you can see like, oh, this is what the model rule is. And then here's how it's been adopted in Nevada and California and Colorado and Utah. And you can see kind of like how have states changed this rule as they've adopted it. So that's a long way of saying there's lots of resources out there. You can definitely take a look at them if you like. But I would encourage you to just take a look at your bar prep company's materials, because what we should do, right, what we try to do, what we have done is to really sort of boil down those rules and give you in plain language, this is what you need to know, without necessarily saying like, go to the comments of rule 1.8, which is the whole conflicts rule. So I would encourage you to take a look at the rules that your bar prep company provides. And one thing that BarMax is going to do, we do adopt the explanations that the National Conference uses. And we do feel like that's really important because we also want to use like real questions that have actually been used on the Mpre, and to give you that opportunity to really see like, how is this stuff tested? Like, how does it actually appear on the bar exam, rather than having, a PR expert read released questions and try to create similar questions. We're going to give you actual real released questions that have been used on the bar. Now, if we do that, though, we are going to adopt the National Conference's explanations of the correct answer. The National Conference is not going to say, hey, go check page 20 of such and such bar prep provider's outline. They're going to say, hey, check the comment. So what I would say is, rather than kind of combing through the comments yourself, like that's kind of what we're for, I would say, if it says, the comment on rule 1.8 and 1.8 is current conflicts, go to your table of contents, find the section on conflicts and review that, rather than trying to wade through the comments themselves. I hope that answers your question. If you have other questions, if you have follow-up questions, please let me know. For those of you who are listening and you're like, wait, what is a comment? Like what? So remember that the ABA model rules are just that. They're model rules. And so experts who have been helping to craft these rules then go through and write, comments on them saying, hey, this is what we were trying to do with this rule. So states, as you adopt it, keep this in mind. So one of the things that BarMax is going to do, and I tried to mention this a couple of times already, but we're really going to try to boil this down. We're going to try to keep it short. And sometimes students will say, well, Jen, do I have to know everything that's in the outline? Yeah, we've kind of done the hard work of paring it down. And so what's in there, you need to know. But we're not going to give you, a bunch of extraneous information, and you don't know what is essential and what is just, important and what is barely relevant. It's like, here's what you need to know, memorize it, and move on. And we're going to ask you to focus on practicing using, we would suggest released questions. But whichever company you decide to go with, practicing those questions is essential. And sometimes people may tell you, oh, if you do enough multiple choice questions, you start to see the pattern. What they mean is that it's the same folks who've been writing these exams for 1,000,000 years. And so they test the same things over and over again. And so once you've seen enough of them, you start to see that pattern. You start to see how this is likely to be tested. Okay. So 2 things I really want you to focus on as you go in to prepare for the exam. So one is going to be attorney-client relationships and conflicts. So when answering that question about comments, as I talked about, Rule 1.8 on conflicts, I brought that up for a reason. It actually makes up, almost a third of your exam. And so, I guess a quarter to a third, right? So, being comfortable with that is going to be really, really important. Like if you, the one area where you can make the biggest difference in your overall score is going to be attorney-client relationships and conflicts. When does the relationship start? How long does it last? What are conflicts, with current clients, previous clients, not previous conflicts, all that. And then I would also suggest focusing on the judicial conduct. Now, judicial conduct doesn't really make up a huge part of the exam, but for most of us who didn't cover it in law school, and again, keep in mind the different focus in law school. The focus in law school is how do we help our students go out and be ethical attorneys. And your professors aren't necessarily expecting that right out the gate, you're going to go be a judge. So they're not super worried about the judicial canon just yet. But you are going to be tested on it on the bar exam. So being aware of it, knowing what it is for the Mpre is going to be important. So if you said to me, Jen, I've got, a weekend, what do I need to know? And you have more than a weekend, guys, but just pretending that like that was what you had, I would say conflicts, judicial conduct. Oh, good question about the if you've taken it before and it's been a while, and the answer is going to vary on jurisdiction, and it looks like Celeste answered that for you. So one thing that I'm going to suggest is that you have a strategy. So if I am working through a conflicts question, this is kind of the flow chart of questions that I'm asking myself. Is this person a client, or are they a former client, or are they a potential client? Where are they? Did this attorney represent this person, or were they an opposing counsel? Like, what was going on? Was it on this matter? If it's not on this matter, and think back to our Jack McCoy example, right? Like he can't go into private practice and, work with a firm that's defending someone against an indictment that he brought, because that's this client on this matter. If it wasn't this client on this matter, can we just wall him off? If you're a government attorney, there's some special rules for you. And last, could you consent away this conflict? So notice that I moved through the exceptions. Well, what about this catch-all of government attorney? What about consent? Is that something that we could do? So kind of having some, like a list of questions that you ask yourself as you move through the problem can be useful. Okay. I want to talk for just a second about judicial conduct and just give you some tips about that. As we said, you're still trying to find that middle path, right? Where you're looking for a judge who is both being impartial, but also appearing impartial. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes you're going to read these questions and you're going to say to yourself, well, this is super impartial. Like what's the big deal? But it's not just whether we think that the judge appears impartial. It's whether the bar examiners think that this is something that would still appear impartial. So definitely there are times that I read these questions and I'm like, I would not want a judge who did that, let me tell you. But if the bar examiners don't perceive it to be impartial, to be partial rather, then it's permissible. So that is part of the practice. It's part of learning what the National Conference of Bar Examiners, believes makes a judge appear impartial. But I can give you some things to kind of look for. So look at what is the closeness between the judge and the alleged impartiality. So, or I said impropriety, either one, both being improper by being partial. So, is this the judge is doing something? Is this like the judge's spouse is doing something? Is this like the judge's law clerk is doing something? How close is whatever is going on that's wrong to whatever it is the judge, where the judge is? And then look at how entrenched, or maybe I really should have said entwined, the judge and the impropriety are. So, is this something that it's not just close, it's not just sort of relationship wise close, but the judge is more of an active participant or less of an active participant? And once you kind of have those two questions and you've sort of worked to memorize the rules of judicial conduct, then it's just practice, practice, practice. Because again, it's about learning kind of where is the middle here, and what does the bar exam, the national conference, what do they think makes a judge ethical or unethical? And it's doing enough questions that you kind of know that. So this, I feel like, is a really good example of that. So again, I would start with the call. Is it proper for judge to accept the gift of the portrait? And I would say, this is helpful because it helps me sort of in my head. Okay. Oh, judge, I got to go to the judicial canon. Oh, gift. I got to think about when you can have gifts. Judge is a judge in the trial court in city. Judge has served for many years as a director of a charitable organization. Okay. So we've got a timeline there, many years. And we've got an adjective, charitable. So anytime I'm seeing adjectives or adverbs, that tends to be an indication that this is going to be important. And if you're one of those people who's like, wait, what was an adjective? What was an adverb? 8th grade English was a long time ago, Jen. Anything that's a descriptor, it's describing something. What kind of an organization? A charitable one that maintains a camp for disadvantaged children. The organization has never been involved in litigation. Judge has not received any compensation for her services. Notice how emphatic they're being there. Never involved in litigation, not received any compensation. The charity decided to sponsor a public testimonial dinner in Judge's honor. As part of the occasion, the local bar association intends to commission and present to Judge her portrait at a cost of $4,000. The money to pay for the portrait will come from a public testimonial fund. Again, if you get grammar clues like that, pay attention. That will be raised by the City Bar Association from contributions of lawyers who are members of the association and who practice in courts of the city. And is it proper for her to accept the portrait? And so what we can think through is going to be kind of that middle path, right? So the best judge, the one who's the most ethical, would probably be like, no, heavens forbid, we couldn't possibly do that. But this is not what we're testing. We're testing what is the rule. And so here it probably is okay, right? It's not like one judge is one lawyer is making the gift. It's a big part of a dinner. It's raised by a bunch of different attorneys. It's not like one attorney who's like, here's a $4,000 portrait, judge, wink, wink. It's, a big event where she's being honored for this work. And it's completely, outside of that. So, we can look at this and say, judge did not receive compensation for her services to a charitable organization. It's incident to a public testimonial, and I think we could say, it is permissible. Okay. I just wanted to show you really briefly kind of what our pricing looks like. And we have, free MBE materials. So you can, MBE, gracious heavens, Mpre materials. So you can, as I mentioned earlier, try out our offerings and get a sense of what you like and what you don't like, whether you find it useful or what you think. And we have like roughly 160 free released questions. And then we also offer two what the National Conference of Bar Examiners calls OPEs, so practice exams, basically. And there's two of those that give you another 60 questions each. If you try them out and you think to yourself, okay, Jen, you've convinced me, I want to try BarMax. You can see, we have a UBE program, we have a California program. If you think to yourself, Jen, I don't need the whole program, I just need the MBE piece, we have MBE as well. So lots of different things in there. As I mentioned, we're here, we're happy to answer questions, whether that's through the message board I talked about, or you can actually just click and send us a question. And after it kind of gets routed through, it comes to me or to Celeste, who's also here. We're the content folks, and so we will answer those questions. We also have tutoring programs. So I am working with a student right now who's preparing to retake the Mpre because she feels like she needs to do that in order to practice, right? So she's working with me and we're meeting regularly. You can book just an hour with us. You can say, you know what, Jen, like I basically got this. I just need to talk to somebody about my schedule, or I've done, all of the questions that are available. And I just have a few that I'm like, about, can we just talk about those? Sure, of course. Or if you feel like I have to get this thing done so that I can, wrap it up. You can also purchase larger packages that allow you to meet with us regularly. I did want to show you a few testimonials that come from our various applicants who've been successful. And I do just want to point out, we do have folks who come from international backgrounds who use BarMax, and that can also be really valuable. So if you're one of those folks and I'm sitting here talking about the comments, you're like, the what now? That's why we've done what we've done in terms of paring down the material and making the outline the way that we've made it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just take questions at this point. Let me see what the Q&A is. Okay, question is, how many practice questions do you recommend we do? Also, how many practice questions should be done at a time before reviewing the answers? I found that if I do too many and come back to review them later, I forget the fact pattern. Great. So, excuse me, hang on. So I would say the second question is actually the easier one. And what I would say with that is you want to, at least in the beginning, I would suggest you do the question, check the answer. And here's the thing. The reason that I suggest that is basically really grounded in educational psychology and learning theory and all that. We know that human beings learn best when they get immediate feedback about whatever they're doing. So think about the last time you had to learn something difficult. When I was a new professor at a mentor of mine said, Jen, you need to learn something new every semester. So you remember what it's like to be a beginner, and you don't know the terminology and you don't know what you're doing and you're kind of embarrassed to get up there and fail. And what does that look like? So for me, that's softball. So, I've done a bunch of different things. Took a cake decorating class. I tried swing dancing. I tried, square dancing, I tried softball, and I keep coming back to softball because I love it, but I'm also really bad at it. So I'm constantly a beginner in softball, even though I'm not really a beginner anymore. I'm still a beginner. So, when I go out there and I'm trying to teach myself to get better at hitting the ball, I don't, lob a bunch of balls at myself, I guess I wouldn't lob them at myself. I wouldn't have the, pitching machine lob a bunch of balls at me and then, swing after all that. I wouldn't sit and read a book about, how to play softball. I might read a book and then try, but I need that immediate feedback. It's not enough to just tell myself, okay, remember to put your bat, above your shoulder and to put your elbow out and turn your foot and, all that stuff. I've got to actually get that immediate feedback of, did it work or not? So as to your second question, especially in the beginning, I want you to do a question, check the answer. Do a question, check the answer. And you know what? If you need to look up a rule, that is A-okay. But if you look up a rule, or if you miss it because you didn't know the rule, I want you to do something with that. So, we tend to be like, oh, the exception for government attorneys, I should have remembered that. I'll have to remember it for next time. You can't do that. We're not going to remember it. Do something with it. Make a little Post-it note. Make a little flashcard for yourself. Stick it up on your wall. Whatever you're going to do to remember that. Now, later on, then I will want you to do more questions in a row. But there, we're not worried about you learning the law, and we're not worried about what you do and don't know. We're just trying to help you get your timing down. So I would go through all of those free questions, the 158 or 59 that we have, first, and maybe use those as the so-called learning questions, where you're keeping, kind of using those as data points about what do I know, what do I not know. And once you've done that, maybe then you do the OPEs, under exam like conditions, to test your knowledge. And so I think that will also go to your first question about how many practice questions. I believe I've answered that, but if you have other questions, feel free to follow up and let me know. Unfortunately, my time is short for the Mpre on March 29th. I am just starting to study now. How many hours, give or take, is recommended to pass it? Okay, so I'm actually going to take that question, Anonymous Attendee 1, in conjunction with the second question by Anonymous Attendee 2. I know there's no precise answer here, but if the scores are scaled, roughly what percentage should I aim for to achieve the California pass score of 86 so I can track my progress on the practice questions in the BarMax Mpre course? PS, the analytics tab is awesome. So the analytics tab is where we will tell you, look, this is how many questions you've done, and this is kind of where you're scoring in those. So what I would say is, there's not as much data that the National Conference of Bar Examiners does not release the same kind of data that is released by the National Conference for the MBE itself. That said, we know that the national average for the MBE is usually about 61 to 63%. So I usually tell folks for the MBE, I want you to be hitting somewhere between, 60 and 70% correct under timed conditions. So I'm going to recommend to you, Anonymous Attendee 1 and Anonymous Attendee 2, that is what I would want you to do as well. I would like you to be aiming to be getting about 60% correct if you're in a state with maybe a lower pass score, and closer to 70 if you're in a state with a higher pass score. That may be a little bit more wiggle room than you actually need to have, but I would rather have you, over prepare than under prepare. And I would also say, it can feel really, really like crunched for time, right? Like, oh my gosh, the Mpre is on March 29th. Like, what do I do now? But the outline is pretty short. You really could probably spend, maybe a weekend day with it and at least have read it all and sort of be familiar with where it is and what it is. And then if you begin practicing the questions as your next step, that's going to help. And I think when time is short, we often try to, I don't know, there can be this instinct of like, I have to know all the material before I test myself. But remember that testing yourself is a way to learn the material. So particularly for those of you who are like, oh my gosh, I've got 2.5 weeks or whatever, 3 weeks, basically. What do I do? I would say for you in particular, focus on testing yourself. It is actually one of the most effective ways to learn. I know Celeste is sick of this story, but it's just like such a cool experiment that they did. Back in the early days of educational psychology, as we were thinking about like, well, how do people learn things? They took these two groups of children who were working in some kind of a factory, right? And they taught both groups the same poem. And with one group, they immediately asked them questions about the poem. The other group goes back to work. Now, these kids are not going home to review the poem, right? They are child laborers working in a factory. It is the turn of the last century, it's 1900s. We'll just say it that way. And, we've got one group that just heard it and one group that heard it and was tested on it. the folks come back a week later, and what they find is the students who were tested immediately after learning about it remembered significantly more than those who just heard the poem. And that data has actually been held up has held up consistently across time. So I would encourage you to, if you have time for nothing else, make sure to test yourself. Okay. For a foreign lawyer, how long do you recommend to study? That's a really great question, Yesenia, and you might need a little bit more time than a student who, studied here in the States. Simply because you may not have done professional responsibility, or I know I was talking with a student the other day who said, look, in my country, this is ethical, like we can do this. It's different here. So, as I'm telling our students who have taken law school here in the States, like, hey, you may not have studied the Judicial Canon. So even though it's a small bit, spend a little more time on it. You may need to do that as well. You might need to spend a little bit more time with that. So for you, what I would suggest is you probably do want to go through and make sure you spend some time in review, and maybe a bit more than the person who would just be doing a quick review and then jumping into testing. You may need to do some review and then a bit more review and then jump into the testing. And what I would say for you folks who may not be as familiar with the rules, right? You're reading the outline and you're like, wait, I haven't heard of that before. Whether that's because your prof just didn't get to it in your ethics course, or because you're a foreign attorney, you want to make sure that you are really reading it to understand, right? I talked a lot about memorizing, but that sort of assumes a base knowledge. So if you come across something where you're like, this is completely new to me, make sure you're understanding. And hey, by the way, practice is a great way to get a sense of whether or not you understand the materials. So Virginia asks, as a foreign lawyer, how long do you need to, how many questions do you need to get to pass? So how many questions do you need to answer correctly in order to pass? And this is a difficult question simply because of the way that it is scaled. And again, because of the limited information that the national conference produces. I've certainly talked with students who, and this will also, I think, address your question, anonymous attendee, about is 40 hours long enough to prepare? I've had students who've said, Jen, I took a weekend and was fine. I've had folks who've said, 40 hours, got to do that. So you want to kind of, I would say, kind of get a sense of where you are, and I would use your own performance to gauge, right? So you can use that analytics tab, or if you're using another prep company, they may have something similar, or if you're just kind of doing it on your own, keep track. How many questions did I do? How many did I get correct? And I would encourage you to be aiming for at least 60% correct. And so Virginia, that kind of delves into how many questions do you need to get to pass? It's going to vary from year to year because of the way that it is scaled from year to year. But generally that percentage, it can be helpful. So, if you think of, hey, there's 60 questions and you want to be getting about 60% correct. So that's going to be about 40 questions, but then not all of them are graded, but you don't know which ones are graded and which ones aren't. So aim for 40, but it could be, as low as 36 or as high as 42, somewhere in there. Okay, here's a question that says, should I go for paralegal studies first? And, I would say that's completely up to you. The ethics for paralegals and the ethics for attorneys are very different. So just in terms of the Mpre itself, be aware that they're different. I would also say if you haven't had the opportunity to practice in a law firm, or you haven't had the opportunity to practice in a law firm in the States, it can be useful to kind of get your foot in the door and kind of see what it's like here to start as a paralegal, but it's absolutely not necessary. We've definitely worked with foreign attorneys both on the Mpre and on the bar exam itself, so it's kind of, you know, what your concerns are and what your goals are that I think would govern that piece. Let's see. Annalisa asks, how many times can you repeat the Mpre? So that is going to be governed by jurisdiction. So, you know, for example, I'm here in California. California will allow you to take it as many times as you want. But I was working with a student in Kentucky who, you know, they do have a limit on the number of times that you can take it. Just the same way that the minimum passing score varies by jurisdiction. The National Conference of Bar Examiners, again, I keep coming back to them, but they have a great publication that's like the Guide to Bar Admissions, I believe is what it's called. And it's available on their website, and it will tell you what is required for admission in every state, from Mpre scores to fees to dates for application to, you know, character and fitness application pieces, like when are those due? So it's a great resource if you want to compare jurisdictions. And for your individual jurisdiction, I would take a look at there we go. Celeste just posted it, the link to the National Conference of Bar Examiners. Go team. Yes, exactly. And you can look at your individual jurisdiction, Annalisa, to get a sense of what your jurisdiction discusses or requires. Let's put it that way. Jack says, when is the next Mpre test date in California? March 29th. That's a really good question, Jack. The Mpre is generally given 3 times a year, March, August, and November-ish. So you can check the National Conference of Bar Examiners website, and they have the most up-to-date information. Do you know if they are allowing people to take the Mpre remotely, like the California Bar Exam? So again, you want to check the National Conference of Bar Examiners website, and they're the ones who are in charge of all that piece of it, and that's where you can find the information to answer that particular question. And in fact, here we go. Celeste is like super handy with that internet, man. She has posted again for us the information about the Mpre and the registration and all that. Mila says, I'm a foreign lawyer. I was approved to sit in the New York bar exam in 2019, and I was going to take it last year, but due to COVID-19, I wasn't able to do so. Until when is the approval valid? Whew, man, that is a difficult question, Mila. And I would strongly encourage you to contact the New York Board of Bar Examiners like ASAP. They just announced over the weekend that they're going to allow, I think it was 20,000 folks to take the bar in New York this year. So I would suggest reaching out to them. Oh, it looks like Celeste may have known the answer to that question off the top of her head. So, oh, same thing that she said, check your jurisdiction. 10K. Yeah. Some ridiculously small number of people are going to be allowed to take the bar exam in New York this year. So reach out to them, like as soon as you get done with this webinar, reach out to them and say, hey, I was approved in 2019. I couldn't take it this year because of COVID. Am I still approved to take it? And if so, I want to register now. And I would encourage any of you who are thinking about taking the New York bar, follow up about registration like as soon as possible. And Celeste, again, our internet guru, has our link to the New York bar exams information here. Annalisa asks, is the remote? Yeah, so the bar exam in New York is remote. If you're asking about the Mpre, the last update I saw from the national conference was that they we're planning to still have folks go into the Pearson View centers or whatever it is. but that could change. So I would definitely check the Npre website for their updates about where they plan to do it in person or remotely. And then your individual jurisdiction may have different rules and regulations as well. Oh, and Celeste even found the note. Oh yes, see, I said 20,000, but it's actually 10,000. Yeah. Virginia asks, what are the answers to the questions you analyzed? And in the first one with our assistant district attorney who wants to represent someone he legitimately already issued the indictment against, the answer is going to be no, you can't do that. And for our judge who wants to get a portrait painted of her from the friendly folks who want to honor her commitment to charity, that's okay. You get to do that. What other questions might you guys have? I'm happy to answer them if you have any others, or for those of you who are like, oh my gosh, I need to call the New York bar. We can end this so you can reach out to the bar exam if that's something you need. Oh, that's a good point, Celeste. So the applications can be submitted April 1st. The exam will probably fill up soon after, so get your application materials ready. I would suggest that across the board. And actually, this is a good segue. I'll just briefly talk about some character and fitness stuff. For those of you who are looking at your jurisdiction and you're realizing that your applications are going to be due soon, your jurisdiction's character and fitness is also something you should look at. And some of those can be very thorough, we'll say thorough, and therefore can take a minute to get all your stuff together. Onerous, yes, onerous would be another word. So I remember for Nevada, I had to list everywhere I had lived within the past 10 years and include at least 2 references from each place. And that meant that, and I had lived in both Reno and Sparks, which is like basically a suburb of Reno, really, but it's its own town, but it's really not its own town. And so I had to find like 2 people from each of those places, which had been at that point, like years and years, whatever the limit, 10 years. So it was like 9 years ago or something. Oh yeah. Driving records you got to get, what else? Fingerprints, all that. And then Virginia asks, is it D or C? Suzanne says all the places over a 30-year period. That's ridiculous. Some jurisdictions do say like from the time you turned 18 or 10 years, whichever is greater, right? But yeah, it can be the takeaway message, folks, is this can be time consuming. So definitely, take a look and get a sense of like, hey, this is what I need in order to, be successful. So Virginia, your question, I think you're saying, is it D or C for the first question we looked at about the district attorney? And the answer there is D. He's the one who helped to sue, or not sue, but issue the indictment. So we can't do that. There's a question here from Innocent that I'm not quite sure I understand. So maybe if you wanted to give me a little bit more, I'd be happy to take a look at that and answer it. Just maybe retype it in the Q&A section. Okay, so for the second question, I have to go back and look at what number was what, or what letter was what. Second question is A. It's fine because it's it's part of, it's not a gift to the judge because, or whatever. So Jack says, how do your questions vary from Adapt-A-Bar or other prep courses? So I would say the biggest difference is going to be, that we're going to use released questions, and we're going to include the explanations from the national conference, and that's going to be true whether we're talking about the Mpre or the MBE. So some bar prep companies will actually take those the questions that the national conference releases and say, okay, we're going to have our experts recreate questions that are similar to this but a little bit different for our students to practice with, which is fine as far as it goes. But to the extent we talked about, like really getting a sense of what the bar examiners believe is essential. You want, from my perspective, I think it's most useful to look at the actual questions that the actual bar examiners have actually written. And so that is something that we are strongly committed to. And then we will use their explanations, which, someone earlier had said, gosh, when I look at those explanations, they reference the comments, and like, do I have to go look at the comments? You don't have to, but if you want to, you can, and the explanations are there for you. But we're also going to provide assistance. So if you read that explanation and you're like, I still don't get this, you can always post to the message board, or you can use the support tab and ask a question, and that will usually that's going to come direct, eventually through to our office, to me or Celeste, and we'll actually answer those questions. Mila says, thank you, Jen. I can really sense your commitment to help us. Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me, actually. My kids the other day were saying, do you, what do you like about your job? And I was saying, I really love the opportunity to be with people on sort of like the last hurdle before they go become, successful attorneys and they're out in the world. And it really is kind of, without getting too mushy, I do kind of feel like it's my calling, in the sense of like, I feel like this is something that it brings me a lot of joy, not just in like, it makes me happy, but like also job satisfaction. So I appreciate that. That's very kind. Thank you. Do we have the option to take the Mpre remotely? So my understanding is that they're still saying like Pearson VUE, but I would definitely check out the Mpre website available through the national conference, and see what the latest information is, because it is changing all the time in terms of the pandemic and what they're willing to do and all that. So definitely take a look at their website, which I think Celeste posted in the chat. The second question is quite dicey. I think the judge should not accept the gift because of any lawyers that might appear before him in the future, and that could cloud his judgment. 100% agree, right? Like, if I were the judge in this scenario, I wouldn't do it. Well, also because apparently like this charitable organization is super important to her. Why not have them donate to the organization? But remember, we're going to go the middle path, right? So you and I might say, don't accept this. Like, what were you thinking? But that's not what the rule says. The rule says, look, if this is public and it's, not to swing a case a certain direction, then it's permissible. So we've got to go kind of that middle path. What's the middle road there? So that's a good way to think about it. Virginia asks, is it possible to send me current questions to practice with? So I believe Celeste has linked, or maybe it was also Katie may have put in here how to reach the app and all that, but that would be the best way to access those questions to practice with. So Faith says, do you recommend we sit for the bar first or the MPRE first or personal choice? That is an excellent question, Faith. And I will say it is in large part personal choice. But here's kind of what I would be thinking about if I were you. So first off, you want to be aware of your jurisdiction's requirements in terms of the MPRE and when you need to take it. So as I mentioned, I'm licensed in Nevada and California, and I've worked with law schools in both states. And so most familiar with their requirements. So Nevada says, you have to achieve, an 85 on the MPRE within 3 years of any bar exam you pass. So it could be 3 years before, or it could be 3 years after. So what some students would do would be to do professional responsibility over the summer between their first and second years, and then take the MPRE in August. Hey, if they didn't pass, if they passed it, great. They have 2 more years left of law school and then the bar exam, and they've got a year, and that's all good. The only caveat that I would sometimes tell them is, gosh, if you only have 3 years and you take it, after your first year, and then God forbid not God forbid, but you have a baby, or there's a pandemic, or snowpocalypse in Texas, or Lord knows what, right? And you end up not taking the bar exam, then you have to take the MPRE again. And it's not a huge imposition, but it is something to be aware of. But California, look, you got to get your 86, and then you just take it whenever, it doesn't matter. So I was able to use my MPRE score from way back in the day, and it was not a problem at all. So I would be 100% certain about your kind of like which jurisdiction you're at and what the requirements are in terms of time as well. Some students will also say, I feel like it's really important to take it after PR. And I tend to agree with that. I do think having a solid background in this is what the rules are, and I've talked about them, and I've read the case law and all that can be super important. The only other thing I would say about that is sometimes students do feel a little bit frustrated because their professional responsibility class is, really focused on the kind of what you should do, where the MPRE is kind of what can you get away with. That said, I do think it's useful. So, outside of recommending that you do take your professional responsibility class first, where and when you take it, is kind of up to you and just kind of what you prefer, but be aware of the specific rules in your jurisdiction. Is Nevada UBE? No, alas, it is not. I asked because the bar for me is harder. I want to pass that first, then take the MPRE in Florida. And we have 2 years within passing the bar, but I've been debating Arizona. Arizona is UBE. Florida is not. But, hey, if you're thinking about portability and scores and all that, maybe you do the MPRE and then the Florida bar and then take the UBE. And I would just double check, in Arizona, hey, what's the rule for the MPRE in terms of Arizona? Or do it the other way and say, well, what if I take the UBE in Arizona and then the MPRE, and then, am I, admitted, and then maybe I can move into Florida. And you might also check in with reciprocity. So even states that are not UBE can still offer reciprocity, where if you're an attorney and you've been practicing for a certain number of years, you can be admitted. Or they may have a slightly different exam. So in California, if you are an attorney practicing in another state, you only have to take the essay portion of the bar exam. You don't have to take the MBE, the multiple choice portion of the bar exam, if you're an attorney who's licensed in another state and practiced. Don't be sorry for asking questions. That's what we're here for. Are you familiar with the Para program? It's comparable to a physician's assistant. So I'm going to bet that's probably something like a paralegal program. I wouldn't say that I'm, okay, yeah. So paralegals basically, physician's assistant is relatively, I believe they're the same thing, although don't physician's assistants get to practice a little bit on their own or have limited prescription writing privileges or something? Anyway, yeah. Okay. So paralegal, the one difference with a paralegal is they can't file thing, so that they still have to be supervised by a licensed attorney. So they can do, they can interview clients, they can, sort of plot discovery plans, they can draft letters and such for the attorney's signature. I guess I would say they're more analogous to a nurse than to a physician's assistant. They kind of, the doctor says, do these things, and they're the ones who are providing the real hands-on service to the patient / client, while the attorney / doctor, is maybe sort of making decisions about how to handle it. Oh, that's another good question. How does character and fitness, which is sometimes called, C and F, differ from the bar and the Mpre? So great question. The Mpre is designed, really, it's just, do you know the rules? So it's just kind of like, where is the line for this rule? And can you, are you aware of where it is? Are you Jack McCoy? Can you stay just this side of what the rule is for the Mpre? And character and fitness is, do you have anything in your background that suggests that you might not be able to be an ethical, competent attorney? So are you, what's a good question? Are you, do you have a history of getting into a bunch of, car accidents? Are you, have you committed fraud with money? Do you bounce every check you write? Are you, previously arrested? Something like that. And this is kind of that really onerous process that Celeste and I were talking about. And I saw some other comments in the chat box here about, having to get our driving records, having to get our, where did we used to live, and all of that part of it. In California, it's an entirely separate process. Like, you need to do a separate character and fitness piece. New York is similar and can actually, their character and fitness can take a minute. In addition to just the actual preparation, it can take a minute for them to actually review you and figure out what that is. The Mpre does not require a background. You just have to, pass the exam or not pass the exam. Annalisa says, is it the same for each jurisdiction? I would say probably not, and you definitely want to check your jurisdiction. Wow, Florida's 3 years. Oof. That's going to take you a minute, huh? Okay, question about accommodations. So accommodations are going to be accommodations for disability. So that can be a physical disability, like you have carpal tunnel, or you need to bring a special pillow for your back in the day when we used to, I guess, go in person, or you need a special keyboard, or whatever the case may be. They can be something, that's sort of an invisible disability, like maybe you have ADD or anxiety or something like that. I wouldn't say that it's extremely hard to get. It does require documentation, and what kind of documentation is going to vary by jurisdiction. I know we keep saying that, but that really is the answer. It's going to vary by jurisdiction. Generally, you're going to need to establish your need for accommodations. So hey, this is the situation that I have. I have a physical disability, or I have a learning disability, or, whatever the case may be. And what accommodations you're requesting. So I'm requesting blah, blah, blah. And then, I need my special back pillow. This is what I need. And then you want to be able to explain why that accommodation satisfies, requires, or requires is not the right word, alleviates whatever the disability is, right? Hey, if I use my special keyboard, it will make my carpal tunnel better, or whatever the case may be. So definitely work with your jurisdiction, and definitely think about your what your needs are and work with all that. Carla has asked, please explain the free services from BarMax for the Mpre. So again, we have the app, and in the app, you're going to find the outline, and you're going to find, I think it's 158 or 160-ish free questions. And then we also have the OPEs, which you can purchase for, I believe, the low price there. Do I think it will be remote for the next year? I really don't know. I mean, different jurisdictions are doing different things. So I know I keep saying this, but really, especially like in the pandemic, definitely make sure to check with your individual jurisdiction and see what they say. Virginia says, this is a question that I would battle with. If you attend a birthday party of a judge who's your neighbor and you have a case before him and you attend the party and you give him a bottle of wine, is it ethical? So again, this is where you kind of want to, kind of be on the middle ground here, right? If you have, so for me, and I was that judge, I would say, I feel really uncomfortable because we have this case right now. I'll tell you what, once you've wrapped this up, why don't you and I get together and have dinner to celebrate my birthday, and just don't worry, we'll just handle it once your case is wrapped up. But under the rules, if it's something slight and incidental and it's, not designed to bribe the judge and it doesn't give the appearance of impropriety, it could be okay. So it's again, kind of like, what is the middle ground? What can you get away with, kind of a thing? And so that question of how much can you give a judge that would be ethical? I guess first off, recognize that, what's ethical, what's right to you and me may not necessarily be the rule. And then also that is going to be super specific about, your individual, the individual fact scenario that you receive in the question, right? So in the scenario you presented of a birthday party with a bottle of wine, it's probably fine. But if they give you facts that say, it's a $10,000 bottle of wine, well, now maybe we've got something different. And so that's why really, really digging into, what we talked about in terms of the key facts, those descriptions, the numbers, the timelines, using those commas and exclamation points and quotes can be super important, because it's going to help you as you see those different variables on the questions themselves. I wonder how much confidentiality has changed with being remote. I don't know, I guess we'll have to figure that out, right? Could you elaborate on what you said, that school teaches us what not to do? So I would actually say school teaches you what to do. School tends to be very much like, this is the right thing to do, right? So, if you were in my class and I was teaching ethics, I would probably say it's probably okay to bring your judge neighbor a bottle of wine for her birthday, but maybe don't put her in that position. After your case is wrapped up, go see her and say, hey, I wasn't able to celebrate your birthday because I had that case in front of you. Can I take you to dinner now, friend/neighbor? So we tend to focus on, what is, the best practice? What should you do? Whereas the Mpre is what is the minimum? What can you kind of get away with? What do you have to do or not do in order to sort of be in accordance with the rule? So good question about IRAC. So issue, rule, analysis, conclusion, or sometimes people will say application, conclusion. They basically mean the same thing. And I would suggest, obviously for your essays, that's the format you want to use. Hey, the issue here is whether, it was permissible for the judge to receive the bottle of wine for her birthday when it was valued at $20. And the rule is, and you give the rule, and then you do your application, and then you come to your conclusion. And I would suggest you try to do that with your multiple choice questions as well, right? So the issue here is that the assistant district attorney charged this client with this crime and received an indictment and now wishes to go to another firm, blah, blah, blah. And try to come to your own conclusion before you get to the answer choices, because they do include kind of distractors there that can, well, they distract you if you haven't already thought about what your choice is going to be. Ooh, man. Any tip on differentiating between may and must and consent and written consent? Well, I will commend you for being at the point where you're kind of asking these questions, because these are the right questions. This is something you want to look at and think about. And I will say consent and written consent. Well, okay, so the first thing I will say is I love compare contrast charts. Celeste is probably like, oh my gosh, Jen, another compare contrast chart. But I love compare contrast charts. So I would say, maybe make yourself a compare contrast chart where you put may and must at the top, or consent and written consent at the top. And then on the left, so you have two columns, right? And then on the left-hand side, you have your specific rules, right? And then maybe in the box, you can put a check or an X or a little example, even if you like, that kind of explain the may versus must, or shall. Shall is one that you might look at too, or consent and written consent, and like when is each one. Yeah. You are very welcome, Faith. I'm super, like I said, I really enjoy this part. So yeah. All right, y'all. Well, we are at 85 minutes. So unless, and I'm not seeing any new questions at this moment. So unless Celeste or Katie has something else that they would like to add, I think I'm going to call this a webinar. All right. So I want to thank you all for attending. I'm hopeful that you were able to take something useful away from this. Like I said, give it a shot, kind of figure out what you like or don't like about the program. Take a look at the app, and let us know if you need anything. We're around. Happy to answer questions. We like it. You are very welcome, Suzanne.